What the heck happened to Gary Goodridge? Once a fan favorite in Pride and the UFC, Big Daddy vanished from the spotlight. So today we're going to be revealing what happens to a fighter when they are past their prime and the dark side of combat sports, all through the lens of Gary Goodridge.
The 6'3", 260-pound wrecking machine lives a gentler life.
I just love flashlights. It's just one of those, I like light.
But the man who loves light is trapped in a dark place.
I truly, honestly believe if it wasn't for the pills that I'm taking, my life would have been done a long time ago.
You think you may have?
Oh, absolutely.
Would you have?
I would have taken my life. Absolutely.
You would have killed yourself.
Absolutely. Mental disability is a huge thing. It's got me crippled.
From a young age, it was clear that Gary was different. He was active, energetic, and had a charisma that drew people to him. Sports became a natural outlet for his boundless energy. Now, while most kids his age were still trying to figure out what they liked, Gary was already making waves in bodybuilding. But it wasn't just his physical presence that made him stand out, it was his determination to be the best at whatever he tried. Gary's journey in sports didn't stop at bodybuilding. He found a new passion in arm wrestling, where he quickly rose to prominence. Winning the title of Canadian champion was just one of the many highlights of his early career. What set Gary apart was his unconventional approach to training. His arms became so strong that he didn't just beat opponents, he overpowered them, often using brute force to crush his competition. But Gary wasn't satisfied with just being good. He wanted to be the best. His biggest achievement in arm wrestling was taking down the American legend John Brzenk, a feat that earned him respect in the arm wrestling community. But even after reaching such heights, Gary knew he had more to give. He wasn't content with staying in one lane. So, despite being over 20 years old with a steady job as a welder at Honda, Gary dared to dream bigger. Like many of us, Gary needed to make a great living. So he put his dreams on hold and focused on practical matters with steady but simple jobs. But the call of the fight never really went away. It kept tugging at him, waiting for the right moment to break free. Gary's first taste of combat sports came through boxing. He trained for several years and even made it onto the Canadian amateur team, where he quickly rose to the top, becoming an undisputed champion. But boxing wasn't enough to satisfy his hunger for competition. Around that time, something new caught his eye. MMA. It was a sport that was just starting to gain traction, and Gary saw it as the next big thing. Now, you might be surprised to hear how Gary got his start in MMA. It wasn't through years of training in various disciplines or by climbing up the ranks in local circuits. No, Gary's journey into MMA began with a phone call. On the advice of his friends, he picked up the phone and called the UFC hotline, expressing his interest in fighting in one of their tournaments. At that point, Gary had only a couple of years of amateur boxing experience and a lot of raw physical power. He hadn't even started training in mixed martial arts yet. But fate has a funny way of opening doors. On the other end of the line was Art Davie, one of the UFC's early promoters. Now, Davie knew who Gary was, not because of his boxing career, but because of his success in arm wrestling. Davie was a fan of the sport and had followed Gary's career, so when Gary expressed his interest in fighting, Davie was intrigued. Of course, getting into the UFC wasn't as simple as just making a phone call. Even in those early days, fighters needed to have some level of training in martial arts. So, Gary began training at a Korean martial arts school called Kuk-Sool 1. This wasn't just about learning new techniques, it was about getting the necessary credentials to compete at the highest level. Gary didn't just train, he dominated. He gave another contender for a UFC contract a serious run for his money, proving that he had what it took to make it in the sport. After just a month of training, Gary was awarded a black belt. There was a catch though. He had to represent the school in the UFC. It was a simple but effective bit of marketing for the school, and Gary agreed. It was during this time that Gary earned the nickname Big Daddy Pimp. His friends came up with it, seeing as a perfect fit for his imposing size and dominant presence. But Gary decided to drop the last part, keeping it simple, just Big Daddy. Gary's debut came at UFC 8 in 1996 at the age of 30. Now, 30 might seem a little late to start a professional fighting career, but Gary wasn't your typical fighter. He was big, he was strong, and he had a presence that could not be ignored. From the moment he stepped into the octagon, fans knew they were in for a show. Over the next 14 years, Gary fought anywhere and everywhere. He didn't limit himself to just one promotion. He took on all comers, from the smallest, most obscure organizations to the biggest and most prestigious ones. If there was a fight to be had, Gary was there, ready to throw down, and fans loved him for it. Gary wasn't just a fighter, he was an entertainer. His fights were must-watch TV, and his popularity soared in the early 2000s. By then, he had become a fixture in PRIDE FC, one of the most brutal and beloved organizations in MMA history. The Japanese fans, known for their deep appreciation of combat sports, celebrated every time Gary stepped into the ring. They knew they were in for a treat, a battle where neither fighter would hold anything back. In his prime, Gary fought some of the biggest names in the sport. He racked up wins against tough competitors, including a knockout victory over Oleg Taktarov, a former UFC champion. But Gary wasn't just facing average fighters. He was stepping into the ring with legends. He had battles with Igor Vovchanchin and Fedor Emelianenko, two of the most feared fighters in the sport's history. Though he didn't always come out on top, the fact that he was even in the conversation with these titans of MMA speaks volumes about his spirit and skills. Gary didn't just compete in MMA. He also made a name for himself in professional kickboxing. From 1999 to 2010, he fought in some of the toughest kickboxing events in the world, primarily in the K1 organization. Now, K1 was no joke. It was the big leagues of kickboxing, where only the most skilled and hardest-hitting fighters could survive. And survive, Gary did, though it came at a high cost. For over a decade, Gary put his body on the line, taking blow after blow to the head, all for the love of the sport and the cheers of the crowd. But fighting is a double-edged sword. The same intensity and toughness that made him a fan favorite also led to serious health problems down the line. Gary's professional kickboxing record stands at 12 wins and 24 losses, with most of those losses coming in brutal fashion. In MMA, he earned 23 wins and 22 losses, with only 4 of those losses going to judges' decision. Sadly, his last 7 MMA fights ended in defeat, and these tough battles took a toll on his body and mind. After retiring from fighting, Gary was diagnosed in 2012 with degenerative dementia, a condition that is commonly associated with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. CTE is a brain condition that has been linked to repeated blows to the head, a tragic reality for many athletes in contact sports. Gary's dementia brings with it memory problems, speech impairments, and excruciating headaches, symptoms that have significantly affected his quality of life.
You constantly forget on a daily basis, all the time.
I'm here with a bunch of people at the party. Met a lot of people here. I'll probably forget that I met them in the morning.
We interviewed you in 2012.
Gary's daily life now is a far cry from his days in the ring. At 58 years old, he relies heavily on medication to get through each day. His regimen is similar to that of Alzheimer's patients, which is no coincidence given the nature of his condition. The powerful hands that once toppled arm wrestling legends and professional fighters now reach out for pills that help to manage his symptoms. In his own words, Gary describes his days as often filled with a sense of depression. He has spoken about how he sometimes forgets basic things, like having a job, and how his memory issues don't improve. They've reached a point where this is as good as it gets. It is a harsh reality, one that many fighters face after their careers are over. Gary's decline didn't just happen overnight. It was gradual, so much so that he didn't even notice it at first. People around him had to point out that he was repeating himself, forgetting things that had just happened.
When did you start having problems that you started noticing, a lapse of memory or whatever your case was?
You know what? It happens so gradually, you don't even really know. People had to point it out to me. Gary, and Well, we just said that a couple minutes ago, and that started to happen about 3 years ago. But I'd say that it goes back further than that.
For someone who has always been strong, both physically and mentally, this gradual loss of control over his own mind and body has been a tough pill to swallow. But Gary remains honest and open about his struggles, offering a stark reminder of the dangers that come with a life spent in combat sport. The toll that frequent head strikes take on a fighter's brain is severe, often leading to irreversible damage. And while we cheer for the knockouts and celebrate the wars inside the cage, the long-term effects on the fighters we idolize are often forgotten. For the first generation of MMA stars, the road was even rougher. They fought in a time when regulations were loose, and athlete safety wasn't as much of a priority as it is today. Kickboxing, in particular, is a brutal sport where fighters are constantly absorbing headshots. This repeated trauma isn't just about the immediate pain. It's about the silent damage that accumulates over the years, often going unnoticed until it's too late. Many fighters like Gary Goodridge have switched between sports like kickboxing and MMA. The allure of fame and the need to make a living drove them to keep fighting, even when their bodies and minds were begging them to stop.
What I think they should have done was what they refused to do. Let me rest. Let me rest. Make me rest.
Goodridge is one of the most prominent examples of what happens when the sport you love turns on you. But sadly, he's far from the only one. Goodridge's friends and family have seen him change over the years. They have watched as the charismatic, lively man they knew faded away, replaced by someone who often forgets conversations he just had minutes before. It's a heartbreaking transformation, and it's one that no fighter or their loved ones should have to endure. Many are of the opinion that Gary Goodridge is suffering from CTE, a brain condition caused by repeated blows to the head. CTE has been found in the brains of deceased NFL and NHL players, as well as boxers and wrestlers. It's a disease that slowly robs individuals of their mental faculties, leading to mood swings, memory loss, and eventually a complete loss of self. There is no way to diagnose CTE definitively while someone is alive. The only way to know for sure is to examine the brain after death. But doctors are fairly certain that Gary has it, and they've told him as much. His symptoms match those of other athletes who have suffered from the disease, and it's likely that his years of fighting, especially in kickboxing, are to blame. It is easy to point fingers and assign blame, but the reality is a little more complicated. Gary will tell you that it was the kickboxing that did the most damage. He fought 38 times in 11 years, often losing by knockout. Even when he was clearly past his prime, promoters kept calling, and Gary kept answering. He needed the money, and there was always another fight on the horizon, another paycheck to earn. The fights that entertained us have left Gary Goodridge and others like him struggling to get through the day. When we tune in to watch our favorite fighters, it is easy to forget the real cost of what we are watching. For us, it's a night of entertainment. For them, it's a life-changing event that can lead to a lifetime of pain and suffering. Promoters and fight organizations have a responsibility to protect their fighters, but the lure of profit often takes precedence. The UFC has made strides in fighter safety, but even with the best intentions, it is impossible to know how much damage a fighter has taken until it's too late. The brain is a delicate organ, and once it is damaged, there is no going back. The story of Gary Goodridge makes you think of other fighters who have taken similar paths. Chuck Liddell, Vanderlei Silva, Rampage Jackson, Tony Ferguson. They've all taken countless blows to the head over the years. Some of them, like Ferguson, are still fighting, despite showing signs of the damage that has been done. They're adults, and they have the right to make their own choices. But do they fully understand the risks? Do they know what's waiting for them down the line? We have also done a complete breakdown of what happened to Chuck Liddell and Tony Ferguson, so be sure to go and check that out.